Welcome back, everybody. We will have a nice long lunch break where we may continue all of our conversations, which I know are very stimulating. And we're good. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, Mike Beckerman.
Thank you. It's my task and also my privilege to introduce Pat Hall. Pat Hall is a professor of music at University of Michigan and head of music theory there. She is an extraordinary scholar, an expert on the Second Viennese School, and also specifically sketch studies, has published quite compelling volumes on Lulu and Wozzeck. In the context of today's event, she's the editor of the Oxford Handbook, Music Censorship. It's a how-to volume. No, it isn't. It's a collection of essays. She is also editor of what I believe is a really quite visionary publication, Music and Politics, on online journal. And she's going to speak to us today about Alban, Berg, and guilt by association. Give her a warm welcome. Thank
you. Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. One of Alban Berg's many eccentricities was his habit of saving nearly every letter he received and every scrap of paper that he wrote on, including musical sketches, drafts of letters, calendars, and other personal documents. This results in a lengthy document trail in which it is possible, more than many other composers who were persecuted during the Third Reich, to see the effects of the censorship on his artistic output and his life. Today, I'm going to share some of these documents and letters with you to show how Berg plotted to survive as an artist in an increasingly threatening political atmosphere. Next slide, please. The authors of Musik und Drittes Reich avoid the term epoch for the years 1933 through 45, since the effect of the Third Reich on music began much earlier and lasted much later. As an example, comments of some music critics during the Berlin premiere of Wozzeck in December 1925 already anticipate those that Berg would receive nearly 10 years later. And in this one, we see atonality is slowly beginning to be a danger to our German cultural music, and it is high time that those still healthy, progressive-thinking musicians in Germany give everything to energetically confront this sinister movement. If jazz bands and nigger tunes invade our German cultural music, atonal hubbub on the other, both working off texts with no foundation, then the situation is indeed serious. And then the next one, please. The atonal composers, meaning the Jews, are encroaching more and more onto the state opera by evoking artificial successes through all means, by forging more successes to the press to appeal to them. Over the long or short run, the Berlin State Opera will thus become an experimental stage on which lobbyists will luxuriously flower. Next slide, please. Nonetheless, during the years 1925 through 1932, Wozzeck was performed 163 times. 130 of these performances are taking place in Germany. In our first document, Berg has meticulously tabulated each performance of Wozzeck, including the city in which it was performed, the date of the performance, and the number of times in each performance cycle. These compilations no doubt serve to remind Berg that despite his current rejection as an artist in Nazi Germany, that he had for 8 years been a success, by any artistic standard. The only performances listed for 1934 is a radio broadcast of a concert version of Wozzeck in London, conducted by Adrian Bolt. We'll now listen to a short excerpt from this performance, the opening of Act 2, where Marie admires her new earrings. Right. In April 1933, Berg first learns of cancellations of Wozzeck in Germany from Hans Heisheimer, head of the opera division at Universal Division. Berg's heated response is typical of this period. And I quote, next slide, please. That Büchner is one of the greatest German Aryan playwrights hardly needs mentioning, and I too, as you'll see from the enclosed family tree, am neither Jew nor foreigner. Rather, as far back as I can follow with the documents that are available to me at this time, 5/8 Imperial German, 3/8 German-Austrian heritage, and up to 4 generations back, also without exception and comprehensively Aryan race, whereby the assumption appears justifiable that my relatives who lived 200 years before that is, the parents and grandparents descended from imperial Bavarian civil servants and military officials, as well as the Prussian, Silesian, Bavarian borderland forebears on my mother's side, would also not be of Jewish descent. In later letters, Berg consistently identifies himself as German rather than Austrian, and brings attention to the number of Aryans versus Jewish conductors he has worked with in productions of Wozzeck. In a letter dated April 20th, 1934, to Heinz Titian, director of the Prussian State Theater, he writes, and we'll have the next slide, "It's no accident that all of the interest in my music has attracted, indeed the positioning of my creative work within the contemporary output has emanated from Germany, where in fact all my greatest works were premiered. The objection that this is the result of Marxist politics in post-war years, or even that it could be seen as a Jewish affair, can be refuted in that, to name only one work among the approximately 20 German theater managers, directors, who at that time took on my opera Wozzeck, and among the equally many masters who performed it, among more than 36 leading personalities of German theater and music, there were a scant half-dozen non-Aryans. And it is clear and irrefutable as that music like mine could only have originated in a German country. Equally clear and irrefutable is the difference in every measure between art that is based on centuries-old German music tradition and the art of every other country and race." And now we could have the next slide, please. Yes, so this is a tabulation Berg made in response. where he's not only saying, look, there were only 6 Jewish artists or directors who took part, but he makes this Berg-like tabulation, and you can see in the square things it says Yud, where he is literally trying to make a factual piece of data for these directors by tabulating. Yeah. Berg even naively attempts to distance himself from Schoenberg's 12-tone method when the work in question, Lulu, is almost entirely 12-tone. He writes again to Heinzheimer at Universal Edition. I could have the next slide, please. One thing is very close to my heart. One must, if possible, avoid speaking about my relationship with the 12-tone system. Please make the various gentlemen there aware of it. If it became public, we could have potentially many difficulties. I would like that the opera is first heard as music without any theoretical discussions. I disputed the connections that I later won't dispute, that I, however, with good benefit could dispute, yeah, because my use of the system is based on a particular type and conception, the problem of tonal and atonal. Political attitudes must be countered with politics. A final blow comes when Berg is informed that Lulu, the opera he's now struggling to complete, will also be banned in Germany. In May 1934, he again sends a family tree to Furtwängler, conductor of the Berlin Philharmonic, who responds, and that's the next slide, please. You don't have to prove to me that you're a German composer. I know you, know your music for some time, and would think nothing of taking on Lulu if it weren't for the text, which, because of the public feeling here in Germany, seems impossible to me at the moment. It doesn't have anything to do with race. Wedekind was also Aryan, rather merely because the Erdgeist tragedy cannot be performed in today's Germany at all, or at least not with a successful outcome. That you're widely considered to be a Jew, which you clearly aren't, shouldn't surprise you, by the way. It's related to your close relationship with Arnold Schoenberg, whose most prominent student you are considered. Berg's final strategy is to repackage his unfinished opera Lulu by extracting passages to be played as orchestral excerpts, a technique he had used to great advantage with Wozzeck. Only the third movement out of 5, Das Lied der Lulu, is sung, thus essentially neutralizing the Wedekind text. Berg aptly refers to his symphonic movements from the opera Lulu as his propaganda suite, and fills it with some of the most romantic Wagnerian-sounding passages of the opera. Still, the only conductor who will consent to perform it in Nazi Germany is Berg's fellow Austrian and close friend Erich Kleiber, who also premiered Wozzeck in Berlin nearly 10 years earlier. The comments of music critics, now working for officially sanctioned newspapers in the Third Reich, give us insight into the peculiar atmosphere at the premiere of those pieces on November 30th, 1934. These comments are available to us because Berg retained a clipping service and assiduously gathered these reviews into scrapbooks. If I could have the next slide, please. The new work of Alban Berg that Erich Kleiber premiered on November 30th in the Second Symphony Concert of the Berlin State Opera is 5 symphonic pieces, a concert arrangement of the Lulu opera. How spun into his workshop, how uninvolved in today's events must a composer be who writes an opera and today takes up material by Wedekind? And even if Wedekind appeals to him, why Lulu? Lulu was the fantasy apparition of bohemians, which really never was the ideal, which never really was the idol of shadowy late romantics. A Lulu has never existed. We would have to disown our mothers, our sisters, as at best, slime from the sewer. Yeah. In fact, Berg chose this libretto at the end of the 20s, long before the creation of the Third Reich. Moreover, he included jazz elements and ragtime that would have been appropriate to the 20s. But a second reviewer makes it clear that it is not just Wedekind that is problematic. Next slide, please. Before the war, Wedekind, in his dramas, threw the accusations of a shattered society in your face. And in the tragedy Lulu, we learn the path of suffering of a tart, presented very refined psychologically. We have other problems to occupy us. We have other ideals, other than the disintegration of a person's soul, other than the disintegration of a decadent strata of society, to watch and be sentimentally amused by it. And now a composer comes along and makes an opera out of this material. His style is romantic. However, in this dreamy music that conveys an unheard of refined tension, the sensational flashiness dominates again and again. Muted trumpets blare, siren-like violin melodies flatter, the percussion drones brutally with bang and boom, and woodwinds sweetly whisper. The core of this music is rotten and inappropriate for the times. It's for this reason that Berg's music is problematic, no matter how brilliant the facade might be. It is also common knowledge among reviewers that no matter how romantic sounding the final product, that Berg has utilized Schoenberg's 12-tone method. And if I could have the next slide, please. And then next reviewer remarks, Alban Berg, in February a 50-year-old Viennese by birth, but with a heritage from the German Reich, has remained true to the style of the time and to his declared Schoenberg discipleship. For clarity, one must explain what 12-tone music actually means. It's the declaration of war against the tradition from Bach to Wagner, and with that, against the development of Western music. While the strength and emotional force of the past music rests on the major and minor scales, particularly on three main tones, cadence, in 12-tone music, 12 emancipated tones are always varied according to a specific principal ordering, end quote. And the next slide, please. A final reviewer widens the context of the concert in mentioning a similar attempt by Furtwängler to include modern music in his concert. He says, in the same moment that the quarrel about Hindemith had led to Furtwängler's resignation had burned out, General Director Erich Kleiber found it appropriate to pour oil on the fire and to perform fragments of the opera Lulu by the Austrian Alban Berg. He shouldn't wonder if he feels pressured after all of this. An unknown singer, Lily Klaus, who appeared before the public in a scarlet dress, conveyed perfectly the decadent sensuality of her part. That is frankly a questionable compliment. It was delectable to watch the audience on this occasion. I noticed no less than 11 people around me with their head leaned against their hands, apparently trying desperately to detect the deep meaning of Alban Berg's music. These heavy laborers trick themselves into looking for something that's not there. Many were caught up in this auto-suggestion, and that's easily explained in that the typical Kleiber audience, in which, as usual, the percentage of Jewish listeners is unmistakably strong, had turned up for the festivity. It would seem then that Berg's many precautions in preparation for this premiere were to no avail. As the composer of Wozzeck, Schoenberg's most prominent student and the adapter of a text by Wedekind, his rejection in Nazi Germany was almost guaranteed. Moreover, features of Berg's music he could not have anticipated. His exotic orchestration and use of jazz idioms further assured complaints from the German press. Yet in the reviews and papers of other nationalities, particularly of countries that would fight or be overtaken by Nazi Germany, Berg's premiere became a cause célèbre for a composer who was still resisting the cultural constraints of the new Germany. Herbert F. Peiser, who published a review of the concert in the New York Times, interviewed Berg in his home a few days before the concert and seemed particularly fascinated by the political implications of this concert in Nazi Germany. And next slide, please. He writes, Eric Kleiber could hardly have picked a more psychological moment for the first performance of extracts from Alban Berg's still uncompleted opera Lulu. With the country in a state of ferment over Paul Hindemith, with Furtwängler under attack for daring to defend him, it took courage to sponsor within the four walls of Hermann Göring's Staatsoper, the latest production of the author of Wozzeck. Mr. Kleiber had this courage and his valor becomingly rewarded. For almost 15 minutes after the novelty, he was cheered, applauded, and recalled. The orchestra had an imported soprano who shared in the ovation. The composer was not present, but if he had been, he would undoubtedly have tasted the savor of glory. However, let there be no mistake. One has to read more these days in the applause lavished by German audiences on infrequent modern works than mere enjoyment of the music or endorsement of the performance. Demonstrations of the sort have an edge of hysteria and recall the times when Italians shouted "Viva Verdi" and meant something else. Berg's rejection as an artist also had a significant effect on his income. Berg's statement of gross income, also retained among his documents, plunged from a high of 22,000 Austrian shillings in 1932 to 6,923.60 in 1934. His calendar for the last year of his life, 1935, has many annotations dealing with death and financial obligations. In addition to the anniversaries of Gustav Mahler's and Emil Herzog's death, he records the exact time of Alma Mahler's daughter Manon's death at 1/4/4.22.4. And now the next slide, please. Here we see his nervous tabulations of every expected expense in the next 6 months, as well as his anticipated income, including the $500 he would obtain from Louis Krasner for composing the violin concerto, his last complete work. During this period, he was also contributing support of 100 shillings per month to his sister and 200 per month to institutionalize his mentally ill brother-in-law, who in 1930 cut off the end of his little finger as an offering to Kaiser Franz Joseph. Berg calculates that he has approximately 2,000 shillings to live on during this 3-month period. Berg's wife, Helena Berg, has often been blamed for his death. Rather than incurring medical expenses, she treated Berg's chronic abscesses during this period using sterilized scissors. However, a typescript in the Austrian National Library written by Helena Berg reveals that only physicians treated Berg during this period. The location of the infected abscess, even after 2 exploratory surgeries necessitating a transfusion, was discovered too late to prevent general sepsis. And the next slide, please. In the last days of his life, the annotations in his calendar are by Helena Berg. She writes fever on Friday, February the 13th. Last hours on February 14th and 15th. Friedemann, the doctor she consulted on the 16th. Spital Hospital on the 17th, the day that Berg was taken to the Rudolf Stiftung in the 3rd District. A final annotation that you see here marks the day he died. A small cross between February 23rd coincidentally his number of fate, and the 24th. If Berg had survived a few years longer, he would have witnessed not only the Anschluss, but his inclusion in the degenerate music exhibition that began in Stuttgart and traveled to a number of German cities and later Vienna. Moreover, Universal Edition would be purged not only of its remaining Jewish composers, but of its Jewish employees, including the director, Jelle Hürtzka, and the head of opera publishing, Hans Heinsheimer. Berg's many personal documents have allowed us a fuller picture than is often possible with other composers who were persecuted during the Third Reich. The title of my paper alludes to Berg's supposed guilt as a student of Schoenberg. However, these documents also show that Berg had a bit of guilt of his own, and that he was self-promoting to the point of aligning himself with Nazi Germany, at least as it existed in 1933 through 1935. Also turning his back on the teacher to whom he professed he was, quote, always a student of Schoenberg. Thank you. So if I could answer any questions, I'd be happy to. Am I going to be the only person who doesn't get questions to see this whole thing? Michael, thank you.
I mean,
Yeah.
so when did you find this material and what's been your reaction to it? How do you get around
Right.
it? Does it not make a difference? Part of what we're always talking about is the relationship between storytelling and works and how you might or should or shouldn't.
Yeah.
And this is a story about a composer that has been put together from these letters, tells part of the truth, but maybe not all of it. How have you responded to it? Or
Yeah. Yeah, after working on Berg research for over 30 years, I practically feel like, I've been married to him or something, And it's a very odd feeling to be disappointed in various aspects of a composer's personality. And that's basically how I felt. Surely we're not in that position and he's going bankrupt. Not to the point that he can't eat, like some people, but he's constantly worrying, he's becoming ill, he's in a, very tight position. And yes, some of these letters have started coming out, like at the Bard conference and so on, and the discussion of, okay, what exactly was going on with Berg? Was he really anti-Semitic? Was he just doing, the usual talk that was going on during that period? But to me, along with other things I've observed about his personality, he was very self-promoting. He would do what was necessary to succeed as an artist, even if it meant stepping over the line a little bit. And I doubt if much more evidence is going to come out. I mean, people, including me, have gone through thousands and thousands of letters that really pretty accurately represent where Berg was at the end of his life, other than this thing about, okay, what really killed him? How did that happen? So anyway, that's my personal reaction to it, is a little bit of a disappointment. This is 1933 to 1935, at the very beginning, but still it's like he's really ready to sell himself a bit to succeed in Nazi Germany. Yes?
I just wanted to say that this conflict between being German and Austrian is very interesting, because Hans Gall was a contemporary of Berg's and was so much the Viennese, but never once referred to himself as an Austrian, and always referred to himself as a German composer. He was Jewish as well. So I mean, this is an interesting sort of mindset, I think, of the period, which is worth just taking note of. But the other thing I would be very interested in, and taking this Austrian concept further, what was Berg's reaction when he was removed from the Allgemeine Deutsche
Yeah, yeah. No, it's true. I mean, during this period of his life in general, he was just angry, angry about all of it. And it was, especially after being highly, highly successful as a composer of Wozzeck, if anything, a star for someone who had created this 20th century very, very daring work, that it actually produced a huge amount, relatively, of income for him, and then to plunge back into kind of the situation he was maybe in World War I. He's not a nobody, certainly, like he kind of was then, but financially, he can't handle things anymore. So, yeah, it's like his rejection, yes.
Did he ever try to leave?
No. Did he ever try and leave or think about leaving? Yeah, he never really got that far. I mean, his big thrust during the end of his life, he was absolutely desperate to finish Lulu because he still had this idea that somehow he could get performances of this and he could push back up. And I don't know, at one point I heard something about some discussion about England, and I don't know the source, but I'm not aware of any real finite plans that he ever made. I think he was still hoping that something would happen in Austria and Germany for him. Yes, please.
Why did you take money from Krasner for the violin concerto?
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, why did he take money from Krasner for the violin concerto? Yeah, it's a very good point. He was desperate for money, and I mean, there were certainly artistic reasons where just with the timing, with Menel's death and so on, and his relationship to Alma Mahler, he felt he could create a masterpiece, but also he could make money. He could make, another $500. Same thing for selling the score of Wozzeck to Library of Congress. He was desperate to make money by any means he could at that period of time. Yes, please.
I can understand why we might feel some disappointment in Berg's behavior, but only if we expect or assume that great artists are necessarily moral paradigms.
True. True.
Who knows what would have happened if Berg lived longer, but as far as he did manage to see what was going on, I don't think he acted differently from the way any one of us might have acted when we had to adapt to radically changing circumstances. Both having to do with lessened income, but also with a more hostile environment in which we have to carry on our careers.
Mm-hmm.
I've often wondered whether I'd be one of these smart ones to leave, when the getting was good or leaving was good. Knowing the way I've behaved in my own life, I'm pretty sure I would not have been. And so, I would have been one of the ones who died in the Holocaust. I'm fairly sure.
Mm.
So I would really try not to
Make judgments.
People who had, at least as far as Berg was concerned, in view of the time when he died, rather limited knowledge of what he was doing.
Right. Yeah, that's why at the end I very carefully word, okay, he's aligning himself with Nazi Germany, but only as it existed 1933 to 1935. Yeah, truly.
But
and
of course, you didn't mention the worst thing he did, which was to apply for Schoenberg's position at the Berlin, where was it?
yeah, Academy, yeah, right.
As soon as Schoenberg fled.
Right, and there's also the annotation that he made in Lulu, an anti-Semitic annotation that when Schoenberg saw it, he said, I won't orchestrate this, I won't finish it, after seeing that annotation. There were certainly things like that, and Berg makes a very interesting case in that he is so borderline, and I think I see the disappointment. It's not like I expect all artists to be, angels or anything. He really did have to work to make his career happen. And I think it's in the general context of other dishonesties and things that I've seen in other letters. Yeah, right, yeah. I guess particularly coming from the somewhat idealized viewpoint, when I was starting out, yeah. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Pat. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who I know personally very, very well. Ken Reinhard is Associate Professor of English and Comparative Literature at UCLA, and that's his official title there, and describes some of his official duties there. I had the pleasure of working very closely with him 4 years ago when we produced another conference, this time focusing on the opera that had been suppressed, opera of the early part of the 20th century that had been suppressed as a result of these Nazi policies. And that symposium, or that conference, coincided somewhat with the LA Opera production of Schraker's Die Gezeichneten, and it was a great deal of fun. And also, it was interesting because neither Ken nor I are technically licensed to practice musicology in the state of California. But what Ken brings to his work in music and with music is a depth of knowledge and a degree of passion that is rare among any of us and all of us. He does as much as anybody in Southern California to promote what can best be described as his enthusiasm for opera and great music of all kinds. He is a great friend to the Orell Foundation, to James Conlon and LA Opera, and now also, clearly, to the Colburn Conservatory. And I welcome him very warmly, Professor Kenneth Reinhard.
Thank you, Bob, so much, and Mike, for organizing what I think is the most beautifully organized conference I've ever been to. It's really... And I want to thank Marilyn Ziering for all the wonderful work that she has been doing here at Colburn and in Southern California, supporting precious cultural legacies. So thank you so much. And finally, I want to thank Mike and Bob for allowing me to give a talk today, which is not strictly speaking on topic, but I do think it is connected and part of our general discussion, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. Moses and Aron is simultaneously a work of stunning philosophical and theological sophistication and a masterpiece of musical drama. In my opinion, one of the greatest operas of the 20th century, but perhaps one of the least performed, at least in this country. While there have been numerous important productions of Moses and Aron in Europe, and there are 2 currently available on DVD, and an extraordinary film production by Straub and Huillet, Schoenberg's masterpiece has only very rarely been staged in the United States. LA Opera presented a concert performance in 2001, but a stage production has never been seen in LA. Schoenberg's legacy in LA has not, in general, been especially well stewarded. In 1996, USC lost the Schoenberg archives to Vienna, and in a very embarrassing snafu, in 2001, UCLA temporarily removed Schoenberg's name from the auditorium of Schoenberg Hall. Schoenberg has never been an especially popular composer, but he's also been attacked to a surprising extent and from a variety of perspectives. In a famous 1952 essay with the blunt title, "Schoenberg is Dead," Boulez criticized what he saw as Schoenberg's failure to comprehend and pursue the full implications of his revolutionary discoveries. Boulez concludes his essay by identifying Schoenberg's failure with that of Moses in the very process of denying the metaphor. Quote, "We must keep ourselves from considering Schoenberg as a sort of Moses who died in view of the promised land," close quote. If Schoenberg wasn't radical enough for Boulez, academic musicology has often tarred Schoenberg as the patriarch of the extreme modernism that culminates precisely in Boulez. There is a common impression that Schoenberg's music, especially pieces composed by means of the 12-tone technique, such as Moses and Aron, is rigidly systematic, intentionally pleasureless, or, while perhaps somewhat influential, simply not the radical event in music history that it was once claimed to be. Schoenberg's music is indeed difficult for both musicians and audiences. But the difficulty of Moses and Aron, I think, has been greatly exaggerated. No doubt it demands a high degree of attention from both performers and audience, but it rewards us with intensely concentrated, ravishingly expressive counterpuntal music. As the philosopher and musicologist Theodore Adorno writes in a remarkable essay on Moses and Aron, quote, "The music is dissonant from the first bar to the last, but it does not sound dissonant for a single instant," close quote. And of course, when staged, the music is able to make another sort of dramatic sense and opens up to multiple interpretive possibilities. We may fault Moses and Aron for the complexity of its ideas, but the difficulty of its music is more than commensurate with the exquisite pleasures it affords, from the uncanny textures of God's polyphonic voice to the frenetic dances at the altar of the golden calf. There are, however, conceptual aspects of Moses and Aron that are indeed challenging and perhaps unsettling. Schoenberg's opera wrestles with the idea of God, and perhaps even sacrilegiously, God as an idea, with the fierce determination of Jacob wrestling with God's angel. Moreover, Schoenberg's Moses struggles with his brother Aron about how to express that singular theological idea politically in order to transform the band of exiles and stragglers fleeing from Egypt into a coherent people. Writing in the early 1930s, under the shadow of the rise of Nazism, Schoenberg is not optimistic about the political future. The opera has less to say about possible solutions than it does about the limitations of each brother's approach, what we might call Aron's rhetorical aestheticism of signs and wonders and such, and Moses's philosophical asceticism, his stubborn insistence on the unalloyed purity of the monotheistic idea. Finally, we experience the conflict of the two brothers in Moses and Aron as a tragedy that offers little hope of redemption, more Sophocles, if you will, than Aeschylus. Rather than a simple story of liberation and the founding of a nation, Schoenberg's opera presents the story of Exodus as a complex struggle for a difficult freedom, an ongoing work that cannot be left to either idealists or pragmatists alone. So let me give you a brief account of the opera's narrative and make some points about two of what I think are its most striking moments. Schoenberg, of course, wrote the libretto in 3 acts, but only completed music for the first 2. His application for a Guggenheim to finish it was turned down, but it's not clear that it was lack of time or money that prevented him from writing the music for the last act. Some people argue that it is complete as it is, as a fragment. And directors must decide whether or not to include the text of the uncomposed Act 3 in productions, and if so, how. Schoenberg's version of the Exodus story is as interesting for what it leaves out as for its idiosyncratic narrative structure and details. Act 1, based on chapters 3 and 4 of Exodus, begins with Moses' encounter with the voice emanating from the burning bush and his reluctant acceptance of his prophetic mission. Moses knows the truth of God, who has awoken the thoughts of the patriarchs in him. But in order to be true, thought must be expressed. Thinking requires prophecy, as God tells him. When Moses protests that, quote, "My tongue is not flexible, I can think but not speak," close quote, God tells him, Aaron will be your mouth. From him will your own voice issue, as from you comes my voice. The brothers' distinct prophetic functions are represented musically in Moses' prosaic Sprechstimme and Aaron's lyric tenor, which together embody the opposition between philosophical idea and rhetorical image in the opera. When the brothers meet in scene 2, it becomes apparent that those roles may conflict rather than complement each other. Moses presents a largely negative account of God as invisible, unrepresentable, unimaginable, as a God whose grace is experienced through understanding, erkenntnis. For Aaron, God is loving and giving. He watches over his creation and rewards and punishes like a parent. Aaron's God is the greatest power, and he loves him, he says, 1,000 times more than other people love their gods. For Moses, God is simply incomparable. There are no other gods. His favor cannot be bought by sacrifice. His justice is not subject to human judgment. With little agreement about the nature of God or the work required of his prophets, Moses and Aaron approach the people with the divine message of liberation. Scene 3 of Act 1 involves one of Schoenberg's most intriguing passages, a moment which conveys the disorienting effect of the monotheistic message, and I want to linger on it for a while here now. We're in the midst of the people who have heard that Aaron and his renegade brother Moses are bringing word of a new God. The Israelites have apparently lapsed from monotheism and have lost their sense of identity and their distinction from the Egyptian culture in which they're enslaved. We recall that in the Bible, the group that flees Egypt is not a single extended family, but an erev rav, or a mixed multitude of slaves and various riffraff. They imagine this God in fully anthropomorphic terms. What will he look like? Will he be young and handsome and gleam as Aaron did? Will he be strong enough to triumph over Pharaoh and the Egyptian gods? Which, with a touch of irony, the chorus suggests that if he's anything like Moses, whom they recall as a murderer, he will have a taste for blood. Suddenly, Moses and Aaron appear in the distance, and the people have a highly disconcerting and perhaps hallucinatory visual experience of their approach. And I want to read this slightly more longer passage. Does Moses wait? Is he moving? Moses waits. No, he's walking slowly. He waits. No, he moves. Aaron moves along with a light step far before him, and yet stands close to him. Aaron moves along far before him, and yet stands, Is Aaron close to Moses? No, he goes before. Is Aaron at Moses' side now, front or in back of him? They're moving, but not in space. Our nearer, our farther, our deeper, our higher have vanished completely. See Moses, see Aaron, they are now here. Close quote. Very strange passage. If in Parsifal, time famously becomes space in the suspended approach to the Holy Grail, here it is space that is fundamentally distorted by the proximity of the divine. The pre-modern world was organized according to established vertical hierarchies, a great chain of being, with the gods at the top, the king, ministers, and priests just below, followed by various descending degrees of religious and social status. And this political theological structure reflected a cosmology in which the earthly and heavenly realms constituted a seamless whole, the reciprocal halves of a closed, spherical universe. This cosmology implies a Euclidean understanding of space as a container with fixed coordinates that determine orientations such as near and far, high and low, and here and there. So the people imagine the new God in the terms of the old, just more so, as, quote, soaring higher than other gods do. They yearn to be lifted up nigh to thee, close quote. But when Moses and Aaron appear in the scene, they're moving, but not in space. At least not in the familiar dimensions of Egypt. The people cannot parse their spatial location, and metaphorically, we might say, where Moses and Aaron are coming from. Just as God had told Abraham to go out to Moses, so Moses and Aaron call the people to go out into the wilderness, to join them in creating a new world without the reassuring stability of fixed political theological coordinates. The promised land that lies in the distance is not simply a choice bit of real estate, but a completely new account of existence, of living in accord with the radical idea that is the essence of monotheism. Hence, the difficulty of acceding to this unfamiliar world is expressed in this passage as a disconcerting spatial instability. The world from which Moses and Aaron approach has the non-intuitive dimensions and infinite elasticity of what mathematicians call a topology, as if the world were a sheet of rubber where orientations such as near and far no longer function the way they do in Euclidean space. Since Einstein, science doesn't understand space anymore as an empty sphere, but uses topological models of points and openings to map its non-intuitive fabric. Hence, we can understand this odd moment in Moses and Aaron as an effective account in spatial terms of the fundamental political theological transformations required by the monotheistic reorientation. And I want to show you just a couple of very brief excerpts from a remarkable production of Moses and Aaron, one of the two available on DVD, which I completely recommend, that was directed by Willie Decker in 2009 in Bochum in the Ruhr Festival. So let's begin just with the first clip, which is the absolute beginning of the opera, just to give you the sense of the strangeness of the space of this particular performance. Are we ready? This is God's voice. The chorus is dispersed within the audience. They have no idea where the sound is coming from. They're kind of looking around. The sound is from above, behind them. Okay, thanks. Just to give you a sense of I don't know if anyone here saw that production. I have not, only the DVD, but it's extremely hard to understand how space is laid out in this particular production. And then actually I'd like to show you another very brief bit where we actually have this episode that I was just talking about of the approach of Moses and Aaron, so you can see how Willie Decker decided to handle this. I don't know, can the lights be lowered? I know the image is really dark. It'll be less dark, but still not great. Is it possible to lower the lights? Okay, they're entering into this box. This is the people. They're entering into this kind of strange enclosure. And they're seeing Moses and Aaron starting to appear. Okay, it's just a taste of that. But it's a very interesting solution to this question. It's as if the people are watching Moses and Aaron approach, not simply from a distance, but from a completely different medium, as if they're in another filmic space, if you will, one which is projected onto the box area that they're in and in the walls around them. So I really like the way Willie Decker demonstrates this as a completely different way of organizing the world by having a completely different medium, if you will. So when Moses and Aaron finally arrive, and before they can say a word, the people clamor to welcome the new God with sacrifices. Quote, "We yearn to give him gold, goods, and living offerings," close quote. Moreover, they're quite frank that this urge to give comes not from love of God, but from, quote, self-love. Giving itself is pleasure, close quote. Sacrifice was essential to their pagan practices, and if their desire to sacrifice is based on the assumption that it will be rewarded, that it is part of an economy and loss and gain, they also realize that giving is a narcissistic pleasure in itself. But Moses proclaims an austere God who cannot be seen and who neither wants sacrifices nor offers rewards other than the freedom offered by non-animistic thinking. And this is a real stumbling block for the people. Aaron tries to make the message more available, and the people are swayed by his charisma and his figurative language. But his rhetoric threatens to pervert Moses' radical thought of the divine. And this opens the central question in the opera: how to transmit the purity of an idea without distortion or loss to people resistant to its novelty. An idea, moreover, that involves a radical reorientation of all political and theological coordinates. For it is the idea of God that Schoenberg presents as the kernel of monotheism. But an idea, as we saw, must be expressed in the world if its truth is to be established. Adorno describes this as the tragic essence of Moses and Aaron, quote, "the insoluble conflict between finite and infinite inherent in the subject matter Schoenberg chooses," close quote. And as much as this is a theological question of how a transcendent and immaterial God can be comprehended without the mediation of representations or images, it's also a political question: how to transform a primitive and incoherent mass, the Erev Rav, into a unified and free people. The people, however, are suspicious of Moses and unimpressed by his invisible God. Finally, they're convinced only by Aaron's magic tricks, turning Moses' staff into a snake, etc. Only through these minor miracles do they come to accept the revolutionary mission, exclaiming in the final lines of Act 1, "We shall be free." Now, Act 2 skips the next 24 chapters in Exodus, with Moses' repeated demands to Pharaoh to let my people go, the plagues, all that stuff, and takes up the story at Mount Sinai, where the people have been waiting impatiently for Moses to return with God's laws, becoming increasingly fractious and quarrelsome, both politically and theologically disorganized. By eliding the long sequence of encounters with Pharaoh, Schoenberg makes it clear that the real struggle for freedom is not with an external tyrant, but with the animistic illusions that cloud the people's thinking and prevent them from cohering as a people. If they have been convinced by Aaron's miracles to follow the singular God into the desert, those miracles have also encouraged their tendency towards magical thinking. And with Moses' extended absence, they grow restive and relapse into their pagan desires. It won't take much for Aaron, who has always liked a good image, to fashion the golden calf for them to worship. Scene 3 of Act 2. In Scene 3 of Act 2, the people gleefully submit to the pleasures of animal and human sacrifice, drunken excess, and rape. The butchers dance, the sacrificial maidens bleed out, and the elderly joyfully commit suicide. But most surprisingly, and this is the other moment I really want to focus on, the sacrificial orgy turns into what Schoenberg describes in his stage directions as, quote, "a desire for mutual giving." Continuing the quote, "Women give each other jewelry, fabrics, and the like, while men give each other weapons, implements, etc. They offer each other food and drink. Some help each other with tasks." Close quote. Although this sounds like a perfect practice of the not yet delivered commandment to love your neighbor as yourself, and the 70 elders celebrate this sudden generosity as the reawakening of powerful human virtues, it's clearly not an expression of contrition for the previous bacchanalia, which continues in Schoenberg's description as an orgy of drunkenness and dancing. The frenetic sacrifice to the golden calf is like the potlatch of destructive gift-giving practiced by some North American tribes. It's precisely this hysteria of oblativity that Moses has railed against. Quote, "Purify your thinking. No other reward is given your offerings," he admonishes when Aaron praises God for, quote, "rewarding those who are faithful to your commandments." The frenzy of giving in this scene is meant to reestablish the orderly world of Egypt from the disorientation of the monotheistic wilderness, where space and now time, with Moses' prolonged absence, seem strangely distended and unfamiliar. Reciprocal giving, in this context, is an extension of the people's desperate desire to sacrifice to the golden calf, and both are attempts to restore the political, theological balance of the pagan world order. When Moses suddenly comes down from the mountain in scene 4, Schoenberg presents the final confrontation between the two brothers. We might assume that Moses' iconoclasm must be the position endorsed by Schoenberg, insofar as Aaron's restoration of idolatry is clearly a disastrous mistake. But this is not Schoenberg's point. In his last lines, in the composed part of the opera, before he, quote, sinks to the ground in despair, Moses no longer believes that his problem is merely his inability to speak, but now that his thinking, too, was in some way erroneous, even a kind of madness. Moses denounces the columns of fire and cloud that Aaron summons to lead the Israelites toward the promised land as pagan images, Götzenbilder. For Aaron, they are, on the other hand, signs of God, Gotteszeichen. No more idols than was the burning bush. And he continues, quote, "In them the eternal does not indicate himself, but the way to him," close quote. For Aaron, there is a crucial distinction between an image, a built, and a sign, Zeichen. An image, we might say, is fundamentally imaginary and tends to blur the distinction between the representation and the thing it resembles, while a sign is a kind of a pointer, something that symbolizes a meaning or a path that it does not confuse with itself. Has Moses made a terrible mistake in failing to distinguish between signs and image, between proper and improper modes of representing the divine idea? If the conclusion of the composed part of the opera in Act 2 seems to imply this, the libretto of the uncomposed third act ends with Moses' withering critique of Aaron's images and the suggestion that the pillars of cloud and fire are Aaron's inventions, not God's. This argument seems to receive divine confirmation at the very conclusion of the opera when Aaron drops dead. In his final condemnation of his brother's methods, Moses makes an even finer distinction between proper and improper uses of the image. Quote, "Here images govern, or literally master, beherrschen, the idea, instead of expressing it. Close quote. The problem is one of representation, but with a distinctly political implication as well as theological. According to Moses, the imagery that Aaron uses is not merely inadequate to God's ineffability, but implies the people's continuing enslavement to a master, not Pharaoh or the pagan gods, but a God conceived in the image of their own self-love. Thus, the central and unresolved problematic of the opera is indeed a political theological question. That is the question of the nature of a God who is beyond human experience, singular, eternal, invisible, implies the reciprocal question of the nature of the people who constitute themselves as united under God's sovereignty. And the people, not Moses, Aaron, or God, are finally, I think, the central subject of Schoenberg's opera. How can the mixed multitude be liberated, not only from Egyptian slavery, but from their own self-love, in order to constitute a new collective subject, Israel? Schoenberg not only describes this question in his libretto, but enacts it in his extraordinary choral composition. As Adorno writes, It is in this sense that Moses and Aron is a sacred work of art, which presents itself as valid, this is Adorno, valid and binding beyond all yearning and subjective expression. And Adorno continues, this is certainly implicit in the pathos of the music of Moses and Aron, whose intensity gives reality to a communal we at every moment, a collective consciousness that takes precedence over every individual feeling, something of the order of the togetherness of a congregation. Within this trans-individual element, the music would simply, without this trans-individual element, the music would simply accompany the events or illustrate them. God's mandate is that the idea must be expressed, and Schoenberg wrestles with the question of how to do it in both music and text. And if music will finally have the upper hand here, it cannot be in the form of Aron's singing or Moses' Sprechstimme alone, but requires the extraordinarily complex collective polyphony of the chorus. And only in a staged performance, that is, only in a defined theatrical space with coordinates that can in turn be unmoored by theatrical means, can the chorus struggle not just to represent, but to embody the monotheistic idea. It is only in staging an opera that the space of a world can be established and the possibility of a new world can emerge. An idea cannot be transmitted integrally either by insisting on its purity or by venturing onto the slippery slope of images and figures, but only through a practice, through the unfolding prophetic activity of investigating its consequences. And such a collective practice is itself what will transform the world and not only lead the people to the promised land, but more essentially, we might say, constitute them as a people. In a 1935 letter, Schoenberg expresses his disappointment with his reception in Los Angeles. Quote, there will certainly be in perhaps 20 years a chapter in the musical history of Los Angeles. The chapter, he indicates, will be titled, What Has Schoenberg Achieved in Los Angeles? And perhaps there will be another chapter asking, what has the people and the society of Los Angeles taken of the advantage offered by Schoenberg? Close quote. Schoenberg reports that 4 or 5 of his most regular and enthusiastic attendees at his lectures are indeed professors from UCLA and USC. But he adds, quote, it's very astonishing that these professors are no musicians, but what I appreciate very much, professors of philosophy, close quote. So my talk today is meant to continue the tradition of philosophical engagement with Schoenberg's work, to urge us all to take advantage of what Schoenberg has indeed offered us, and most importantly, to suggest that it is time now to recover Moses and Aron here in Los Angeles. Thank you. I understand we have time for questions.
We do have some time for questions.
Or even better, comments.
Yes, Walter.
I have a historical remark to make observation. I attended the lecture that Boulez gave by the name of Alors, Schoenberg, and More. He gave it in French in the 50s. I think he didn't speak English, but not very well. In any case, I said to Schoenberg, and of course that moment I'll never forget, when Boulez said Alors, Schoenberg, and More. Lucas Foss translated the French into English. That's my observation.
Thank you, that's really interesting.
Could you synopsize that for a
I'm not sure I can actually. Lucas Foss himself did the translation of Boulez's remarks about Schoenberg into English.
Lucas Foss, his family immigrated from Berlin to France, to Paris, and he grew up in Paris, and then they came to America. He spoke flawless French.
Yeah.
And very good English. And he had one word
Could you stand up so we can hear a little bit?
Even further off topic, so maybe you don't welcome, so I apologize for that in advance. I think it may also be a question for Pat. We just heard two talks about operas that are either incomplete or sort of questionably complete. And I was thinking about that. I mean, you quoted Adorno a couple times. You wrote about lateness with respect to Beethoven, this kind of generalized condition. So, for all of us, is there a sort of condition of questionable completeness in 20th century opera that might unite works like Lulu, Moses and Aron, Busoni's Doctor, Fowler, Stephen Furtenbach, maybe Context from the House of the Dead, is something about the first part of the 20th century that we talk about ways to go beyond the individual biographical styles and characteristics of works.
That's interesting. I wonder, though, if it's truly a modernist phenomena. Maybe in music it is more so, but one has to think back to, the writings in the Athenaeum, the Schlegel brothers on, the notion of the poetic fragment, right, way back in the beginning of the 19th century. I think that there was a strong German sense that the fragment has a kind of a life of its own, that it is a kind of a strange whole. And I wonder, clearly there are some cases where fragments are not intended to be such. With Moses and Aron, it's a little complicated. Clearly Schoenberg wanted to finish it, but it's not as if he couldn't finish it for any real practical reason, as far as I know. I think there's a certain sense that it may really be complete, and precisely, I think, in the libretto. So I really think the libretto of the third act needs to be included in performances in some way. The question is really how. But perhaps, Pat, you want to answer that too? Where are you? There.
I think it's a fascinating idea, and I could imagine it's been done already in an edited volume, dealing with the philosophy of incomplete works. I agree very much with you, though. I don't really associate it as a 20th century phenomenon, but it's just a reality in any period.
Comments?
So, you did say you were off topic, but, late in the day, as the conference formal part of it perhaps comes to an end, one begins to think that it's hard to imagine a single performance of a single work that hasn't in some way been impacted by something that could be called censorship. Whether it's, under the communist period, people going into exhibits about Janacek and taking out the line, in every human being a spark of God, whether a dissident could conduct, and so I guess I'm going to throw it at you in a sense, how broadly could you extend this? And how might you understand what, perhaps taking this broad view, could be considered a contemporary censorship of Schoenberg?
It's a good question. Sorry. I have a tendency to wander. I do think that censorship is not the right word for Schoenberg in this context, but it's clearly fascinating that there really is just very little Schoenberg performed anywhere in America, and when Moses and Aron is truly a rarity. And it seems to me that there's a different kind of process going on. One can make the distinction between suppression and, if you will, repression. I think that, if anything, Schoenberg has been subject to our own, if you will, psychological repression, that we found his music to make us uncomfortable. And in fact, there have been many gatekeepers who, pronounced that Schoenberg is dead. Not from Boulez's perspective, but from the perspective of it being, arrogant, high modernist, difficult. And I think that there's been a kind of sort of people relax it. Okay, good, we don't have to worry about Schoenberg anymore. And I think that's a real mistake. I think that that he's an unbelievably compelling, vibrant composer, and not simply because of the history of music that came out of him, and led maybe to some dead ends. There certainly is a chance that there's been a kind of formal working out of Schoenberg's idea that doesn't have a lot of room anymore. Nevertheless, I think Schoenberg himself is what people need to listen to. And again, the 12-tone technique is just a technique, as Schoenberg was always, emphatic about. It wasn't the message or the truth of his work. It was simply a way of working. So I think our censorship is really not censorship. It's, in a sense, discomfort, a sort of a sense that modernism was too demanding of us, that both the ideas and the music just asked too much of us. And indeed, for all those various capitalistic reasons that we've been talking about, he doesn't sell tickets because it's not a hummable tune that you're going to leave the opera house singing like after Traviata. And I do think that that's our fault as a culture. It's not, it's by no means a kind of an official censorship, obviously, but we have let Schoenberg down, if you will. Is that helpful, just from where I'm coming at?
One more question. Yes, sir.
But I think that's general, and that there are several different forms in which this censorship, suppression, whatever you want to call it, take. Under Hitler's Germany, it was who was the question you asked. Under the Soviets, it was the what sort. Under ours, it seems to be temporal. If it's old enough, it's fine to listen to. If it's new, forget it.
Well, I don't know. I think there's less Schoenberg performed now over time than more. I wish there was some truth to that. I think there is some truth in the sense that we get more familiar. It doesn't sound as difficult. What I'm really urging people to do is, instead of saying, oh, Moses and Aaron, go and listen, go and see a production, urge people to make a production, see the DVDs. This is utterly compelling, dramatic, powerful work, and the music is fantastic. I think it's a simple thing that we have, kind of backed away for various complicated reasons that historical reasons that I'm really not qualified to talk about. But it's become a sort of a sore spot, and people, they want something lighter, I think, and I think this is a problem.
Professor Fink.
Yes, Ken, I don't want to rain on the parade at this late date, but as someone who actually wrote a master's thesis on Arnold Schoenberg, which is unreadable, it should remain invisible, unrepresentable. Don't go look at it. And who had training as a professional music theorist in a world where Schoenberg was the single most important composer of all time. So I would point out there was definitely a
There's a lot of questions there, Bob. First, let's just go back to the musicological one for a second. It seems to me that there is this history within musicology, and I'm sure you suffered, by the dominance of Schoenberg. But I'm really sorry that you wrote a master's thesis that you think is unreadable, because why should one write unreadably about music, even if it's complicated? It seems to me that, yeah, there's been a real academic mishandling and maybe an elevation, deification, if you will, of Schoenberg that isn't helpful. To me, those are all institutional issues, and they've had very negative effects outside the institution in terms of people's response, the possibility of staging work, right? Just having it out in the open. I mean, we have less Schoenberg staged in Los Angeles than we have, Schrecker or Ullmann or, Zemlinsky. And that, so I think that there has been a strange history. And I think that it's time, though, for Schoenberg to not simply be, left in the charge of the music theorists who want to, make him into this kind of supreme mathematician, because it's music, and this is music theater, and people need to experience it. In terms of how to stage Moses and Aron, well, there have been unbelievably important, interesting directors who have taken on that challenge. In fact, Peter Stein has done a Moses and Aron. Barry Kosky who's now doing a lot of work for LA Opera. He's doing one this spring. Achim Fryer, who did the LA Opera Ring, did a remarkable Moses and Aron. I will defend that. Yeah. I guess God doesn't like Achim Fryer either. If you had gone to the final cycle of the Ring, you may have had a different opinion than the people who saw the first cycle. It really became, I think, a great work. It's not an easy production, but I think it's an original and powerful and emotionally very strong production. All I'm saying is that, yeah, there's difficulty in staging, complicated operas. But I think the real difficulty in Moses and Aron is the rehearsal time, getting an orchestra, getting the singers to master this material, which is, excruciatingly difficult. I think the staging, and again, I recommend the Billy Decker production. It is Veggie Theater. You will see naked, bloody bodies, precisely as described in the libretto. So he's absolutely faithful to it, actually. And that may be too strong for some people, but I think it's what Schoenberg was trying to do. I mean, we should try and make sense of it and not simply say, we don't do that sort of thing.
Excellent. Thank you very much.